John adjusted the communicator headset, leaning back in his chair on the bridge of the Explorer, a mid-sized human spacecraft tasked with surveying the outer edges of known space. A faint, rhythmic signal blinked on his monitor. "Captain, we've picked up a distress signal," he announced, his tone laced with curiosity. The captain, a seasoned officer named Carolyn, approached, her brow furrowed. "What kind of signal?" "Alien," John replied, tapping a few keys to enhance the transmission. The signal carried an unearthly melody, almost like a song, but interspersed with static. "It's not automated. Someone's out there, and they're calling for help." The crew exchanged glances. Finding a stranded alien in this part of space was rare, almost unheard of. The captain nodded firmly. "Let's investigate, set a course, and proceed with caution." Minutes later, the Explorer arrived at the source of the signal. Drifting in the void was a sleek silver craft, its surface scorched and dented, as if it had been through a fierce battle. The faint glow of its engines indicated it was barely operational. "Scan for life signs," Kara ordered. John worked quickly, his fingers dancing across the console. "One life form aboard," he said. "Weak, but alive." With her characteristic decisiveness, Kara made her choice. "Prepare the docking bay. We're bringing them in." The team suited up, ready to assist whoever, or whatever, they found. When the airlock finally hissed open, John was the first to see her. She was unlike anything he had imagined, tall and slender, with silvery skin that shimmered faintly under the ship's lights. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes scanned the room, cautious but alert. "Hello," John said, keeping his tone gentle. "We're here to help." The alien woman, draped in tattered robes, looked at him with suspicion. Her voice, melodic and soft, echoed in the quiet room. "Help, human. Why?" John blinked, slightly taken aback by the question. "Because you're in trouble. Isn't that reason enough?" She hesitated, as if weighing his words. Then, with visible effort, she extended a delicate hand. "I am Cyrith. My ship was attacked. I had no choice but to call for help." "Well, Cyrith, you're in good hands," John said with a reassuring smile. He gestured toward the medical team. "Let's get you checked out." As the crew escorted her to the med bay, Cyrith cast a wary glance at John. "You are different," she murmured. John chuckled. "Different good or different bad?" Cyrith tilted her head, clearly puzzled by his humor. "You joke at a time like this. Strange." John grinned. "Welcome to human hospitality." For a moment, something softened in Cyrith's expression, though she quickly masked it. She was safe for now, but the shadows of her recent ordeal lingered. Little did she know, her journey with these strange humans, and their peculiar humor, was only beginning. Cyrith sat quietly in the medbay, her gaze fixed on the sterile white walls. The hum of the ship's systems filled the air as the humans worked around her. She observed them with a mix of caution and curiosity. Their movements were efficient, but their expressions were so open. It was unsettling. John walked in, carrying a tray with what he called basic human food. He placed it in front of her with a cheerful grin. "Figured you might be hungry. It's not gourmet, but it's edible." Cyrith eyed the tray suspiciously. On it were strange items. A packet of something squishy, a small metal container with a straw, and a round flat object that smelled faintly of oil and herbs. "What is this?" "Food," she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "It's a sandwich," John replied, pointing to the round object. "And juice in the container. The squishy thing. That's pudding. Sweet stuff. Trust me, you'll like it." Cyrith hesitated, then carefully picked up the sandwich. She took a small bite, her silver eyes widening slightly. "It is acceptable," she said after a pause, her tone almost begrudging. John chuckled, leaning against the wall. "High praise. I'll take it." She glanced at him, her gaze sharp. "Why do you laugh so often, even in serious moments?" John shrugged. It's just how we deal with things. Humor helps us stay sane, even when things are falling apart. Humor, Cyrith repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. My people do not laugh. It is seen as a weakness, a distraction. That sounds exhausting, John said, shaking his head. Sometimes you've got to laugh to keep from crying. It's what makes us human. Cyrith tilted her head, studying him. His words were strange, yet there was an odd wisdom in them. You use humor as a shield, she said thoughtfully, to hide your fears. Maybe, John admitted with a grin, but it works. Before Cyrith could respond, the ship jolted and an alarm blared. The intercom crackled to life. Captain speaking. We've detected an unidentified ship approaching fast. All crew, prepare for potential conflict. Cyrith's demeanor shifted instantly. Her shoulders tensed, and her hand moved instinctively to her side, where she likely once carried a weapon. They have found me, she whispered. Who? John asked, his grin fading as he noticed her sudden change. The ones who attacked my ship, Cyrith replied, her voice steady but urgent. They will not stop until they have what I carry. John's brow furrowed. What are they after? Cyrith hesitated, then looked him straight in the eyes. A key to something they fear, and something they would kill to possess. John nodded, his usual lightheartedness replaced by determination. Well, they'll have to go through us first. As the ship's systems powered up for defense, Cyrith watched John. His humor had vanished, replaced by a courage she hadn't expected. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to humans than she had assumed. The ship shook as the unidentified vessel closed in on the Explorer. Red warning lights flashed in every hallway, and the crew scrambled into position. Kara, calm under pressure, stood by the bridge, giving quick orders. Shields up. Get those weapons online. Prepare for combat. John sat in his seat, eyes scanning the screens, but his mind was elsewhere. Beside him, Cyrith stood rigid, her silver skin almost glowing in the dim light. She looked out the window, her expression unreadable. Don't worry, John said, trying to keep things light. We've been through worse. A little chase never hurt anyone. Cyrith glanced at him, her eyebrows slightly raised. You joke again? At a time like this? John shrugged, offering her his usual grin. You'll get used to it. Humor is like a survival skill. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, still skeptical, but a small spark of something, maybe curiosity, maybe amusement, flashed in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but for the first time since they met, she didn't look at him like he was completely insane. The ship lurched again, this time more violently. The enemy ship was getting closer, and their weapons were locked on the Explorer. Kara's voice came through the intercom, tight with urgency. We need to keep them distracted. John, can you do your thing? John straightened in his seat, a sense of determination taking over. On it. He tapped a few buttons, pulling up the ship's comm system. Let's see if I can buy us some time. He leaned into the mic and spoke in his most confident, upbeat voice. Hey, ugly, your mama called. She said you should stop chasing us and go home. There was silence for a moment, then static crackled back. You think insults will save you, human? Came a deep, grating voice. John's grin only widened. Oh, it's not an insult, just a little family advice. You should take it. Cyrith watched, a mix of disbelief and curiosity on her face. John's voice had been light, almost playful, but his words had struck a nerve with the enemy. She had expected a fierce confrontation. Not this strange verbal game. The enemy ship hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to respond. That small pause was all John needed. He quickly keyed in a series of commands that triggered the Explorer's defense systems. Energy shields flared to life, and blinding light filled the space between the ships as energy blasts exchanged in a quick, furious burst. The enemy ship fired another round, but this time, the Explorer dodged, and their return fire hit the Marauder's vessel dead center, sending it veering off course. John couldn't help but laugh. "And that, my friend, is why you don't mess with human ingenuity." Sirith stared at him, her expression still unreadable. Then, to John's surprise, she spoke, though it wasn't what he expected. "You are reckless." "Maybe, but it works." "And you do it for fun?" Sirith asked, her voice almost gentle now, the tension between them slowly dissipating. John grinned again. "Yeah, it's how we keep from going crazy. Laughter makes the hardest things easier." Sirith studied him, her eyes softening. "It is strange," she admitted, "but I think I understand." It wasn't much, but it was a start. John's humor, which had once been a mystery to her, was now something she was beginning to understand. A glimpse into the complexity of human strength. For the first time, Sirith felt a small weight lifting from her shoulders. Maybe there was more to these humans than she had realized. The explorer drifted silently through the dense nebula, its bright lights piercing the mist of swirling gas and dust. Outside, the stars were barely visible, the thick cloud of particles blocking all but the smallest glimmers. Inside, the crew moved like shadows, preparing for the worst. The communication system was down, and the ship's systems were unreliable. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the whole galaxy was holding its breath. John sat in his seat, monitoring the instruments, but his mind wasn't on the ship's condition. Instead, he kept glancing over at Sirith, who was standing by the window, her arms crossed. Her eyes, like always, were distant, her mind clearly far from this place. "Hey, Sirith," John called, his voice breaking the stillness. "How are you holding up?" Sirith turned her head slightly, her gaze unreadable. "I am fine. This nebula is nothing compared to what I have faced before." John leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, well, space can be a little overwhelming sometimes, even for us humans." A faint flash of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "Humans are odd. You act as if danger is something to be laughed at." "Sometimes it's the only way to deal with it," John said, his voice calm but serious. "Laughter doesn't make the danger go away, but it helps us keep going. Otherwise, you'd just crumble." Sirith said nothing, but she seemed to consider his words. The tension in the air thickened again as another jolt shook the ship. The comms were still down, and the engines barely functioned. The crew was trapped in this eerie pocket of space with no clear way out. John sighed and stood up. "Well, no sense in waiting around for things to get worse. How about I tell you a joke to lighten the mood? You know, the kind that's so bad, it's good." Sirith raised an eyebrow. "A joke? In this situation?" "Why not?" John replied with a shrug. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sirith looked at him, then out into the vast, dark space beyond the window. She seemed to weigh his offer before nodding. "Very well, but your joke better be worthy of a distraction." John grinned. He stood tall, ready to deliver his best bad joke. "Okay, here goes. Why don't skeletons fight each other?" Sirith tilted her head, genuinely curious. "Why?" "Because they don't have the guts," John finished with a dramatic flourish, smiling at her. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to his surprise, a soft sound escaped Sirith's lips, something between a chuckle and a gasp. It wasn't much, but it was a start. You think that is funny?" she asked, her voice almost incredulous. John's grin widened. "Come on, it was a good one. Skeletons, no guts. Get it?" Sirith didn't answer immediately, but the corners of her mouth twitched and her eyes softened. It was clear she wasn't quite sure what to make of this odd human custom, but something in her had shifted. "I do not understand fully," Sirith admitted, her voice low, "but it does make me feel less tense." "Well, that's the idea," John said with a wink. "It's just a way of making things feel a little less heavy." The tension in the room seemed to ease, and the crew exchanged glances, noticing the change in the air. For the first time since they entered the nebula, there was a sense of lightness. John leaned back in his chair, content with the moment. Cyrith, still adjusting to human ways, now understood something new: how laughter, no matter how strange, could work as a lifeline in the dark. "I'll take another one," Cyrith said, her voice a little more relaxed. John smiled, ready to deliver his next joke. The humor was far from perfect, but in that moment, it was exactly what they needed. The Explorer had just finished its narrow escape from the nebula, the stars now visible again, offering a sense of calm after the chaos. The crew was exhausted, but there was little time to rest. The threat from the marauders had not disappeared. It only felt like a temporary break. Kara stood at the helm, her brow furrowed with concern. "We need to stop at the nearest station for supplies. We can't keep going like this. Our fuel's almost out, and the ship needs repairs." John nodded, looking over at Cyrith, who was once again standing by the window, her posture stiff as if still on alert. She hadn't said much since the nebula. Despite their brief moments of camaraderie, she remained distant. He had noticed that about her, how she carried her past like a weight, always keeping it hidden behind her calm exterior. "We'll stop at the station," John said, offering a reassuring smile. "Get some rest. We'll be fine." Cyrith didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the stars outside. It was clear that the idea of resting was not something she was used to. She had lived her life on the edge, always moving, always cautious. Trust didn't come easily for her. And it wasn't just the danger from the marauders she feared. There was something more, something hidden beneath her calm face. The station wasn't far, and soon they were docking, the crew preparing for the routine exchange of supplies. John helped carry some of the crates off the ship, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he passed a few of the station's workers, he noticed a few suspicious glances in his direction. He wasn't sure if it was just paranoia, but it didn't sit right with him. Cyrith noticed it too. "There is something wrong," she whispered, her voice low and cautious. "I can feel it." Before John could respond, an alarm blared from the Explorer, the sound sharp and urgent. "Captain, we've been locked out of the ship. Someone's tampered with the controls." Kara's voice crackled through the intercom. "John, Cyrith, get back here, now." Without thinking, John grabbed Cyrith's arm and pulled her towards the airlock. But it was too late. They were already surrounded. The crew of the Explorer stood in a tight circle, the betrayal still fresh and the atmosphere thick with tension. John, Cyrith, and the rest of the crew were trapped in the dark, narrow corridors of the station. The sounds of heavy footsteps echoed in the distance as their would-be allies turned enemies moved in closer. The supply officer, now their captor, motioned for his men to keep watch while he stepped forward. "You're in our hands now," he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "No more running for you." John glared at him, his fists clenched. "You've made a big mistake." "Have I?" The man chuckled, clearly enjoying the situation. The ship's airlock hissed shut, sealing them in the cold, dimly lit hallway of the station. John's pulse raced as he crouched low behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding in his ears. Cyrith stood beside him, her silver eyes scanning the room, her body poised and ready. The air around them felt thick with tension. The sounds of the guards' boots clacked through the narrow corridors, echoing off the walls. "They think we're done for," John muttered, his breath steady, but his fingers twitching with anticipation. "But they don't know what we're capable of." Cyrith gave him a silent nod. She had been quiet since their capture, her mind clearly calculating every move. Her expression remained calm, but John could see the flicker of determination behind her eyes. She had learned to trust humans, but she had also learned that trust alone wouldn't save them. Now it was time for action. "We need to move fast," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. If we can take control of the station's central systems, we can shut down their security and gain the upper hand. John raised an eyebrow, impressed by her plan. You know how to hack a station's systems. Sereth gave a slight smirk, though it was a rare sight. I am not a hacker, but I understand how to manipulate technology. I will guide you. John nodded, his grin returning. All right, let's do this. They moved quickly, darting from cover to cover, using the shadows to hide their movements. The guards were still oblivious, their attention focused on the main hallway. As they approached the central control room, John felt his nerves spike. This was it. If they failed, there was no coming back. Sereth stepped up to the door and paused. She closed her eyes for a moment, reaching out with her senses. Then she nodded. This way. They slipped inside the control room, the door hissing open with a soft sigh. The room was dimly lit, filled with various consoles and screens. Sereth immediately began scanning the systems, her fingers moving across the controls with precision. John kept a lookout, his hand on the blaster at his side, ready for anything. As Sereth worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. The system was complex, more advanced than anything she had seen before, but she was determined. She had spent years on the run, learning how to survive, how to outsmart enemies at every turn. This was no different. You're doing great, John said, his voice low but encouraging. Sereth didn't reply, her attention fully on the task at hand. After a tense moment, the console beeped. A green light flashed, signaling that she had breached the system's defenses. Done, she whispered, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. John felt a surge of hope. Nice work. The station's lights flickered, then went dark. The hum of the security systems cut off, and the monitors went blank. They had done it. The station's defenses were now offline, and their enemies were vulnerable. But as they turned to leave, the door to the control room slammed open. A familiar voice echoed through the room. I knew you'd try something like this. John froze. The voice was cold and filled with malice. Standing in the doorway was the last person he had ever expected to see. Captain Carolyn, the leader of their crew. She was holding a blaster in her hand, her expression hard and unyielding. Sereth's gaze hardened as well. You? Kara stepped forward, her stance firm. I didn't want to do this, but you forced my hand. You had to be stopped. John's heart sank. You were working with them all along. Kara didn't flinch. I was just trying to protect us. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. John couldn't believe it. He had trusted her. They had all trusted her. And now she had betrayed them. Everything they had fought for was unraveling before his eyes. The cold silence of the control room was shattered by the harsh reality of betrayal. John stared at Kara, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Sereth stood beside him, her silver eyes narrowed, her posture tense and ready for a fight. You've got to be kidding me, John muttered under his breath, his voice thick with disbelief. Kara's expression remained cold, unreadable. She lowered her blaster slightly, but didn't holster it. This isn't personal, John. I did what I had to do. You sold us out, John said, his voice sharp. You sold everyone out. Kara's gaze flickered to the door, and for a brief moment, John caught a hint of doubt in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the steely resolve he had come to expect from her. I did what I needed to survive, she replied flatly. You don't understand. The universe is ruthless. We can't keep playing by human rules if we want to make it. Sereth stepped forward, her voice cold and calm. And what makes you think you're the only one who understands survival? You've put everyone at risk. The humans, the aliens, all of us. Kara's eyes flicked to Sereth, then back to John. I didn't expect you to understand, but I did what was necessary. The Marauders have been hunting me, and this station, this alliance, it's the only way to stop them. John's anger flared, but he quickly forced it down. He couldn't afford to lose control. They needed to think, to act. "You're working with them, Kara," John said, his voice steady. "And now you're the one who's in over your head. You think they'll just let you walk away once they've got what they want?" Kara hesitated. The truth of his words seemed to strike a nerve, but she quickly masked it. "I'll figure it out. I always do." "You're not in control anymore," Scifi said, her voice firm. "You've made your choices, and now you'll deal with the consequences." There was a long, tense silence. Kara raised her blaster, her finger hovering over the trigger. John's heart beat faster. He had no idea what she was planning, but he wasn't about to let her take them down with her. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The marauders were coming. Kara's face hardened as she realized the situation was slipping out of her grasp. She cursed under her breath. "Listen to me, both of you," Kara said quickly, her voice now tinged with desperation. "We need to work together. If the marauders get here, none of us are getting out. They'll kill us all. Help me, and I'll make sure we all escape." Sirith's eyes narrowed. "I don't trust you." "I'm not asking you to," Kara snapped. "I'm asking for survival." John exchanged a glance with Sirith. They had no choice. If they didn't work together, they were all doomed. But there was a catch. John wasn't sure he could ever trust Kara again. "All right," John said, his voice hard. "We'll work together, but the moment you double-cross us again, you won't get another chance." Kara nodded, her eyes cold. "Agreed." The walls of the station began to shake as the marauders breached the outer perimeter. The countdown to their final confrontation had begun. John, Sirith, and Kara had no more time for words. They had to act, together, or not at all. Sirith stepped forward, her eyes focused, her body brimming with readiness. "Let's do this." John took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the blaster at his side. The moment of truth had arrived. They would face the marauders head-on, not as enemies, but as uneasy allies. The station shook as the marauders finally breached the last defenses. The sound of heavy boots and clanging metal echoed down the hallways. John, Sirith, and Kara stood in the shadows, waiting, the tension so thick that it seemed to suffocate the air. "They're coming," John whispered, his hand resting on the blaster at his side. The plan had been set, but he knew it wasn't foolproof. There was always the chance they could fail. The marauders were ruthless and well-equipped, but they had one thing the enemy didn't: unpredictability. Sirith's gaze was fixed on the hallway, her expression calm but her body tense, ready to spring into action at any moment. Kara, on the other hand, seemed impatient, glancing between the others, her eyes hard with determination. "We need to act quickly," Kara said, her voice low but urgent. "Once they're in the control room, we won't have time to fight back. We need to get ahead of them." John nodded. "Right. We take them out before they get here." He turned to Sirith. "You're sure you can handle the systems once we get to the control room?" Sirith gave him a slight nod. "I can override their access points. I'll shut down their weapons and control systems. But we need to move now." The sound of footsteps grew louder. The marauders were getting closer. John could feel his heart racing in his chest. He had never been a soldier, but he had fought before, always relying on his wits to get out of sticky situations. This time, though, he wasn't sure jokes would be enough to save them. "Let's go," John said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. They moved swiftly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the station's halls. They'd reached the control room entrance just as the first group of marauders rounded the corner. John didn't hesitate. He stepped into the hallway, drawing his blaster and aiming it directly at the lead marauder. "Hold it right there," he said, his voice calm, though his hands were shaking slightly. The marauder stopped short, raising his weapon to point at John. But before he could pull the trigger, John's voice rang out. "Why don't skeletons fight each other?" John called out loudly, his grin back in full force. The marauder froze, clearly confused. What? John didn't give him a chance to process. Because they don't have the guts, he shouted, following up with a grin that was as wide as it was insane. The marauder blinked, his confusion giving John just enough time to make his move. He fired a quick shot, disabling the weapon in the marauder's hand. The leader staggered back, clearly unsure of what had just happened. "What's wrong with you?" The marauder growled, trying to recover his footing. John winked. "I'm just here for the punchline." With a quick motion, Kara fired, taking down the remaining marauders who had tried to flank them. Sci-Fi wasted no time. She rushed into the control room, her hands moving swiftly across the consoles, hacking into the system. The lights flickered, then shut off as the power to the marauders' weapons was cut. The tide had turned. The marauders were now vulnerable. "We're in control now," Sci-Fi said, her voice steady, but filled with a sense of accomplishment. John gave her a thumbs up, then turned to Kara. "I guess the joke really did save the day." Kara, despite the situation, actually smirked. "You're ridiculous, John. But I'll admit, it worked." John laughed, feeling the tension finally lift. It wasn't just his humor that had saved them. It was the teamwork, the quick thinking, and their ability to adapt that had turned the situation around. For a moment, he felt the familiar rush of victory. They had done it. But the battle wasn't over yet. The real fight was still to come. The station was eerily quiet now, the last of the marauders either captured or defeated. The lights flickered back to life, bathing the control room in a soft, steady glow. John stood in the center of the room, his body still wired with adrenaline, but the weight of everything they had just been through was slowly starting to sink in. They had won. Sirith stood by the terminal, her hands still resting lightly on the controls. She had been the one to disable the enemy systems, to ensure their victory. She glanced over at John, and for the first time since they'd met, there was something soft in her eyes, something more than the distant warrior she had been when they first encountered each other. John caught her gaze and smiled, his heart still racing from the battle. "I guess we make a pretty good team, huh?" Sirith didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, her expression thoughtful. Then, finally, she gave a small nod. "Yes, we do." Kara stepped forward, wiping sweat from her brow. Her earlier coldness had softened, though there was still a hard edge to her demeanor. She glanced at John, her voice more subdued than before. "You were right, John. You were right about everything. We've been fighting the wrong battles. We should have been fighting for each other." John looked at her, feeling a mix of relief and caution. He didn't trust her completely, not yet, but he could see that she had changed. At least in this moment, there was a small flicker of respect between them now, something that hadn't been there before. "We can't change the past," John said quietly, "but we can make sure we don't make the same mistakes again." Kara nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I'll do my part," she said. "We'll all do our part." The tension in the room began to lift, replaced by a shared sense of relief. But Sirith wasn't ready to relax just yet. She stood still, her attention now on the distant stars visible through the control room windows. John noticed her distance, her gaze intense, and he walked over to her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Sirith's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, John saw the weight she had been carrying for so long, the loneliness, the burden of her mission. "I must," she said softly. "My people need me. I cannot stay here." John felt a pang in his chest. He had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. They had been through so much together, fighting, surviving, learning from one another, and now she was leaving. "I get it," John said, his voice quiet. "But before you go, you know, I'll miss you. It's not every day I meet someone as unpredictable as you." Silrith's lips curved up ever so slightly, the hint of a smile. "I could say the same about you, human." They stood in silence for a moment, the bond between them stronger than words could convey. Then Cyrith turned to the door. "I will remember you, John. You have shown me that strength comes in many forms. And you've shown me that it's okay to trust," John replied, his tone sincere. Before she left, Cyrith paused at the threshold, her voice soft but clear. "If our paths cross again, I will be glad." John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Me too." With that, Cyrith stepped into the hallway, leaving the explorer behind. John stood in the doorway, watching her go, but not feeling sadness. Instead, he felt hope. They had fought through impossible odds, and together they had won. And who knew? Maybe their paths would cross again someday. As the ship's engines hummed to life, ready to take them back home, John turned to Kara. "What now?" Kara looked at him, her expression still serious but softer than before. "Now we make sure this never happens again. We stand together, and we face the future." John nodded, knowing that whatever came next, they had each other's backs. They had learned the hard way what trust really meant. And that, John realized, was what made them truly strong.